Let's get started. Story number 1.
A few years ago, I worked as a night shift security guard at an old, rundown hospital that had been shut down for over a decade. The building was filled with eerie, silent hallways, the smell of mildew, and the sound of creaking pipes. The hospital was no longer in use, but it was still the property of the state, and the company I worked for was contracted to ensure it was secure. I'd spend my shifts walking through the long corridors, checking doors, and occasionally sitting in the guard's office trying to pass the hours by scrolling on my phone. It was a job that didn't require much attention, but the place itself was unsettling. One night, everything changed. It started like any other shift. I showed up, signed in, and began my rounds. The first couple of hours were quiet, and I started to get lost in the monotony. But then, while I was on the second floor, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, like a voice carried through the walls. I paused, straining to hear it. It was strange. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the building. The hospital was long abandoned. I walked over to the nearest door, my flashlight casting long shadows on the cracked tiles. I opened the door slowly, unsure of what to expect. The room was empty, just the remnants of old hospital equipment left to rot. The whispering seemed to come from the air itself, as though it was echoing through the building, but when I looked around, no one was there. Shaking my head, I continued my rounds. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps my tired mind was playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. This time, louder, closer. It was unmistakable, a voice coming from the stairwell. I took a deep breath and made my way down the hallway toward the stairs. My footsteps echoed through the vacant floors, and as I approached the stairwell, the air felt thicker, colder. I stood there for a moment, listening, heart racing, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice. The whispering grew louder, more frantic. Then, suddenly, it stopped. A cold chill washed over me as I turned to leave. That's when I noticed it, a faint, dark shadow moving across the far end of the hallway, almost like a figure walking in and out of the light. My stomach dropped. I knew there shouldn't have been anyone else in the building, and not even a vagrant or trespasser. The hospital had been locked down for years. I cautiously walked toward the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow moved again, disappearing behind a wall. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I rounded the corner, shining my flashlight toward where I saw the shadow last. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I checked every room on that floor, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. The voice was gone, the shadow was gone, and the building returned to its usual unsettling silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I made my way back to the guard office, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. The hours crawled by, and just when I thought I'd finally gotten over the strange experience, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft thud, followed by what sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps coming down the hallway. I froze. My phone vibrated in my pocket, but I couldn't move to answer it. The footsteps were getting closer, each step heavier than the last, like something or someone was getting closer and closer. I grabbed my walkie-talkie, my hands trembling as I called out to anyone who might be on duty, but the radio was silent. The footsteps continued, growing louder, until they stopped right outside the office. I didn't dare look up from where I sat, terrified of seeing something standing just beyond the door. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I heard the sound of something scraping against the floor, like a chair being dragged across the tiles. I wanted to bolt, but my body felt frozen in place, unable to move. Then there was a knock on the door. It wasn't a gentle knock, but a harsh, insistent banging, each knock like a heavy thud against my skull. My mind raced. Who the hell was here? Why was someone knocking? I should have called for backup, but the fear paralyzed me. The knock came again, louder this time. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, heart hammering, and slowly approached the door. I could hear my breath echoing in my ears, and as I reached for the handle, I heard a whisper. "Let me in." I recoiled, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The voice was soft, but it carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't open the door, not with that voice on the other side. I backed away, grabbing my phone again, trying to reach anyone, but the signal was dead. I was alone in that empty, decrepit building, with whatever was outside the door. The knocking continued, almost rhythmic now, and with it came the sound of dragging again, closer to the door. I backed further into the office, searching for something, anything, so I could defend myself. But the office was small, and there was nothing there. Suddenly, the door swung open with a violent crash, the hinges rattling. My body went cold. There was nothing in the hallway, no figure, no shadow, just the emptiness. I rushed to the door and slammed it shut, locking it. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, wondering if I had imagined it all. But the air felt wrong, like something was watching me. The whispers came again, this time from all directions. "Let me in! Let me in!" I couldn't take it any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the exit, praying that the front doors weren't locked. As I made my way down the long hallway to the main doors, I could hear footsteps following behind me. Slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was trailing just behind me. I didn't dare look back. Finally, I reached the main doors, my hands fumbling with the keys, my panic growing with each passing second. When I finally managed to unlock them and push the door open, I didn't stop to look back. I ran out into the cold night air, my heart racing, not stopping until I was safely in my car. It wasn't until the next day that I learned the truth. The hospital had once been the site of a gruesome murder. A patient had been killed by another in the middle of the night. The murderer was never found, and it was said that his spirit haunted the building. I never went back to work there again. And to this day, I can still hear the whispers. They follow me, lingering in the back of my mind, always just out of reach, as though they are waiting for the day when I return. Story the end.
Story number 2.
When I was 22, I took a job as a late-night clerk at a 24-hour convenience store in a small, run-down town on the outskirts of the city. The store was barely visible from the road, tucked away between two abandoned buildings. It was a grim place, with flickering fluorescent lights and stale air. Most of the customers were regulars, often coming in for cigarettes, beer, or a quick snack. I worked the shift from midnight to 8 a.m., and honestly, it wasn't that bad. There were very few customers at night, and I mostly spent my time scrolling through my phone, waiting for the shift to end. That changed one cold, dark night. It was well past 3 a.m. when a man came in. I'd never seen him before. He was tall and thin, wearing a long, weathered trench coat that seemed out of place for the time of year. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes had a dull, vacant look to them. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. I barely noticed him at first, distracted by my phone, but when I heard him clear his throat, I looked up. He was standing at the counter, staring at me without saying a word. His presence was unsettling. There was an intensity about him that I couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed a few crumpled bills on the counter, his eyes still locked on mine. He didn't say anything as I rang up his items, a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of whiskey. It felt like the entire store had gone silent, the hum of the refrigerator and the flickering lights the only sounds breaking the stillness. I handed him his change, and he left without a word. There was something about the way he moved, like he wasn't really there, as if he was a ghost drifting in and out of the world. I shook it off, thinking maybe I was just overtired, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the man came in every night at almost the exact same time, around 3 a.m. He would buy the same things, always cigarettes and whiskey, always with that same strange, vacant expression on his face. Sometimes he would linger a little longer, staring at me as if waiting for me to speak, but I never knew what to say. The silence between us became heavier each night. I started to get a little paranoid. Was he watching me? I couldn't tell. Every time he walked out of the store, I'd feel a strange, uncomfortable sensation, like someone was standing just behind me, breathing down my neck. But every time I turned around, the store would be empty. One particularly cold night, I was closing up the store, ready to leave for the night, when I noticed something strange. The man had left behind his empty whiskey bottle, something he'd never done before. At first I thought maybe he forgot it, but then I saw something odd. The bottle wasn't empty. There was a note rolled up tightly inside. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unrolled the note and read what was written. I'm coming for you. The time is near. Don't leave. My blood ran cold. My hands shook as I reread the words. Who would leave a note like that? My mind raced with thoughts of what it could mean, but no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't escape the fear that gripped me. The next night, I went into work with a heavy sense of dread hanging over me. As the hours passed, the store remained eerily quiet, except for the occasional customer. Then, at 3 a.m., the man came in again. But this time, something was different. His eyes were wide, almost feverish, and his movements were erratic. He walked straight up to the counter, his voice low and hoarse. I need you, he said, his tone sending a chill down my spine. I froze, unsure of how to respond. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. Please let me in, he whispered. It's time. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. His breath smelled sour, and I could see a faint trickle of blood staining his lips. He wasn't drunk. He was something else, something not quite human. I don't understand, I stammered, trying to steady myself. What do you mean? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached over the counter and grabbed my wrist, his fingers icy cold. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, sending a jolt of fear through me. His eyes were wide, unblinking. You shouldn't have left, he said, his voice low and guttural. Now it's too late. I yanked my wrist free, stumbling backward. My breath came in short gasps, and I could feel the sweat forming on the back of my neck. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out of there. I ran toward the door, fumbling for the keys. As I turned the lock and shoved the door open, I glanced back one last time. The man was standing at the counter, staring at me with that same cold, lifeless gaze. He didn't move. He just watched me. I rushed outside and didn't stop running until I reached my car. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 questions I couldn't answer. Who was he? What did he want from me? I didn't return to the store the next night. I couldn't. The thought of being alone in that place, of seeing that man again, filled me with terror. I called my boss and told him I was quitting. I didn't care if I was being dramatic or overreacting. I wasn't going back. But when I went to pick up my last paycheck, I found something I hadn't expected. An old photo buried deep in the drawer of the front counter. It was a picture of the store from years ago before I started working there. In the corner of the photo, standing just outside the front door, was the man. But what sent a shiver down my spine wasn't just his presence, it was the date on the photo. The year was 1987. The man had been dead for almost 30 years. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was a cold, rainy night when the strange events began. I had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of a small town. The place was inexpensive and had character. Large, drafty rooms with creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, and a feeling of history lingering in every corner. I loved it at first, the idea of starting fresh in such a secluded place. I had heard nothing but positive things about the area, but as it turns out, some things are better left undiscovered. I didn't realize the extent of the house's unsettling nature until my first night there. The rain was pounding against the windows, the wind howling through the trees outside. The house felt unusually cold, and despite the heater being on, I couldn't shake the chill that had settled in my bones. I sat in the living room trying to distract myself with a book when I heard it. A faint knock on the door. It was strange, quiet, almost hesitant, but clear enough for me to hear it over the noise of the storm. I stood up, my heart rate speeding up for reasons I couldn't understand. No one had come by earlier, and I didn't know anyone in the area yet. I opened the door, my eyes scanning the empty porch. There was no one there, just the storm. I shut the door quickly and locked it, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was just the wind or my imagination, but the thought of being alone in that old house felt unsettling. The feeling lingered, and no matter how many times I tried to convince myself otherwise, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my gut. The following days were quiet. I began to get used to the house, its quirks, the sounds of it settling, the shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. But at night, the silence was always broken by something. A creak from the attic, a soft tap against the windows, things I couldn't explain but tried to ignore. I began to chalk it up to the age of the house. Old houses made strange noises, after all. Then came the first real encounter. It was late one evening, and I had just finished dinner. The rain had stopped, and the house was eerily still. I was getting ready to turn in when I heard it again, the knock at the door. Soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. I walked slowly to the door, hesitated for a moment, then opened it cautiously. Again, no one was there. But something was different this time. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the room itself had become suffocating. And then I saw it, a small folded piece of paper on the doorstep. I reached down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The note was simple, written in a hurried, jagged hand. "Get out while you can. It's coming for you." My heart pounded in my chest. I looked around, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing. Just the empty street, the wet pavement glistening in the dim light from the porch. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my mind racing. Who could have left this? Was it some sick joke? I spent the rest of the night trying to distract myself. I put the note and pushed it out of my mind, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing strange sounds, faint whispers, creaks from upstairs, even the unmistakable sound of footsteps walking around in the attic. But when I checked, there was no one there. It wasn't until a week later that the real terror began. I had come home from work and noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I never used the basement, as it was damp and musty, but there it was, the door hanging open as if someone had been in there. I stepped inside cautiously, the darkness swallowing me as I reached for the light. When the bulb flickered on, my blood ran cold. The basement was a mess. Old furniture, boxes of things that had long been forgotten, and dust everywhere. But what caught my attention was something new. A chair, placed in the center of the room, facing toward the far wall. A chair that had definitely not been there when I moved in. I felt my heart race. I took a few steps toward it, my breath shallow. The chair looked old, the wood creaking under the slightest touch. I couldn't help but feel drawn to it, the strange compulsion pulling me closer. When I reached it, I noticed something odd. Scratches on the floor beneath the chair, as though it had been dragged across the room. And then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced as I turned to leave the basement, but as I reached for the door, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slowly, methodically, as though someone was walking toward me, just out of sight. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I ran out of the basement, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. The rest of the night was a blur, my thoughts too scrambled to focus on anything except that chilling voice and the feeling of being watched. Things only got worse from there. Every night the sounds grew louder. Footsteps pacing in the attic, whispers in the corners of the house, things being moved around when I knew I was alone. The sensation of being watched never left. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, unable to scream, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. And then came the dreams. They started innocently enough, flickers of shadows in the corners of my vision, glimpses of figures that I couldn't quite make out. But as the days passed, the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, as if something had been standing over me, just inches away. The worst part was that the dreams started to blend with reality. I would wake up in my bed, but sometimes I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I'd hear faint breathing, footsteps across the floor, and the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the floorboards. When I'd check the room, there would be nothing there, but the house felt wrong. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things and called a moving company. I couldn't stay there. Couldn't stay in a place that felt like it was suffocating me. The landlord was shocked when I told him I was leaving, but he didn't seem to question it. He just handed me the keys and said, "Some places aren't meant to be lived in." I didn't sleep the night I moved out. I didn't look back. I don't think I ever will. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that house, even when the landlord called me a few weeks later, asking if I wanted to come pick up the rest of my things. I told him I'd already taken everything, and I never told anyone what happened, not fully. People don't believe in ghosts, or at least they don't want to. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. Some places leave a mark on you, even if you don't understand why. And I don't know what was in that house, but whatever it was, it's still there, watching. Story the end.
Story number 4.
It was the summer of 2013 when I moved into the old farmhouse on the edge of town. I'd been looking for a place that was quiet, away from the hustle and bustle of city life, and this seemed like the perfect spot. It was cheap, despite its age, and the owner, a reclusive old woman named Mrs. Jenkins, was eager to get someone in the house, as it had been sitting vacant for years. I'd heard a few rumors about the place from locals. They spoke of strange noises at night, lights flickering without cause, and the occasional sighting of a shadowy figure in the upstairs window. But I wasn't one to buy into local superstitions, and to be honest, I figured these stories were just that. Stories. The house was large, with creaky wooden floors and a dusty smell that no amount of cleaning seemed to get rid of. There were strange marks on the walls in some rooms, like something had been scraped or scratched into them, but I didn't think much of it. Mrs. Jenkins had told me it had been in her family for generations, and she had no interest in maintaining it anymore. Her words lingered with me, though. She said, "The house doesn't like to be alone for too long." That statement stayed with me for weeks, but I brushed it off as the ramblings of an old woman. The first few nights were uneventful. The air was thick and heavy, typical of the area, and the wind howled through the cracks in the window panes. I'd been alone in the house for about a week when the strange events started happening. At first, it was subtle, just odd things that I thought could be easily explained. I would leave a room only to find that the door was now closed, even though I knew I had left it open. The floorboards in the hallway would creak like someone was walking just out of view. I chalked it up to the house settling. After all, it was old, and these things happened in old houses, right? But then, one evening, it happened. I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard footsteps upstairs. It wasn't a creak of the house settling, it was the distinct sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps like someone walking around. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps came closer to the stairs, and then nothing. Silence. For a few moments I sat there, straining my ears, wondering if I had imagined it. I even convinced myself I had. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way up the stairs. The house was dark and cold, and the air felt stale. I walked slowly down the narrow hallway toward the guest room where the footsteps had sounded the loudest. When I opened the door, the room was empty. I checked under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. I shrugged it off, though my heart was still racing. Maybe I had just been hearing things, or maybe it was a rodent in the walls. That would explain the sound, I thought. The next night, the footsteps returned. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a kitchen knife, feeling foolish as I tiptoed around the house, convinced I would find someone hiding in the shadows. But no one was there. Again, the room was empty, the house eerily still. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me feeling more unsettled than ever. Over the following days, the occurrences increased. I would hear doors creaking open at night, sometimes a faint whisper in the hallway that I couldn't quite make out. I started sleeping with a nightlight on just to give myself some comfort. But even then, I could feel something watching me. It was on the fourth night that things took a darker turn. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone softly crying. The sound was coming from upstairs, from the same room where the footsteps had been. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay frozen under the covers, straining to listen. The crying was soft at first, like someone trying to be quiet, but it grew louder, more desperate. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. But before I could press send, the crying stopped. I waited, terrified, my phone still in hand. Then, without warning, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall. They were slow, dragging, as if someone or something was walking with great effort. I stayed where I was, not daring to move. I could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer, and I swear I could feel the floorboards creak beneath the weight of them. Then the door to my bedroom slowly creaked open. I turned to look, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. No one. I jumped out of bed and ran downstairs, calling my parents, telling them I needed to come home. I couldn't stay another night in that house. I didn't care if I was overreacting. Something was wrong. Something in that house didn't want me there. The next morning, I went to the local library to dig deeper into the house's history. What I found disturbed me. The house had been owned by a family many years ago, one that had fallen into tragedy. The parents had died in a car accident, but their daughter, a young girl named Emily, had been left behind. She was found days later, starved to death, locked in a room in the attic. Some of the older townspeople believed she had never really left the house. According to the records, Emily had always been a quiet child. She would talk about the man in the walls, but no one took her seriously. They thought she had imagined it. It wasn't until after the family's tragic deaths that people started hearing strange noises coming from the house, noises that no one could explain. Whispers, crying, footsteps in the attic, and sometimes the sound of children laughing. When I got back to the house that evening, I had the feeling that I was being watched. The air felt heavier now, oppressive even. I called Mrs. Jenkins, demanding to know more about Emily and her family. She hesitated, her voice trembling when she spoke. "She never left," Mrs. Jenkins said quietly. "She's still there in that house." I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't explain further. That was when I realized she knew something about that house, something she wasn't telling me. I wasn't sure if it was out of fear or just reluctance, but I could sense that she knew more about the dark past of the house than she was willing to admit. I spent the next several days trying to figure out a way to leave, but every time I tried to pack my things, the house seemed to push me back. The noises became worse. The whispers grew louder. The footsteps never stopped. I couldn't sleep anymore, not without hearing her cries or feeling her presence at the door, waiting. One night, I decided to confront whatever was in the house. I went into the attic alone, flashlight in hand, determined to get to the bottom of it. The air in the attic was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight. I walked slowly, my breath coming in quick gasps as I approached the far corner of the room. That's when I saw it. In the corner of the attic, there was a small wooden door, barely noticeable, hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It was the door to a tiny, forgotten room. My heart hammered in my chest as I approached it. I knew I shouldn't open it, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for the door handle, and with a deep breath, I pulled it open. Inside was a small, barren room. It was cold, damp, and covered in cobwebs. But what made me freeze was the wall. Scratched into the wood was a single word: help. I stumbled back in horror, feeling like I had uncovered something that wasn't meant to be found. The feeling in that room was overwhelming, as if the air itself was heavy with sorrow and rage. I never went back to that house after that night. I packed up what little I had left and moved far away. I never spoke to Mrs. Jenkins again, and I never looked back. But sometimes when I'm alone in the dark, I still hear her crying. Story the end.
Story number 5.
I had always been a skeptic when it came to anything supernatural. I grew up in a small town where ghost stories were just something the older folks told to entertain us, and I never really gave them much thought. But the events I'm about to share with you turned my world upside down. It was the fall of 2012 when I moved into an old apartment building in a quieter part of the city. The place was cheap and had character: brick walls, creaky floors, and tall, narrow windows that gave it a historic charm. It wasn't much, but it was all I could afford. The building itself looked ancient, but the landlord assured me everything had been renovated, so I didn't think much of it. I remember the first night vividly. I had just finished unpacking my boxes and was getting ready for bed when I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a subtle, almost hesitant tap. I thought it was a neighbor, so I opened the door, but there was no one there. I checked the hallway, which was dimly lit and empty, and shrugged it off as someone having made a mistake. The building was old, after all, and the floors were creaky. Maybe someone had knocked and walked away too quickly. But that wasn't the only thing that happened that night. As I was lying in bed, I kept hearing strange noises. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, but as the night wore on, the sounds became more distinct. A faint scraping noise like furniture being moved around, but there was no one else in the apartment. No one had keys except for me and the landlord. I got up several times to check, but each time I found nothing. Just silence. I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. The following days were much of the same. Unexplained noises, creaks, and taps on the walls. But it wasn't until the second week that things started to take a darker turn. I was sitting in my living room when I felt a sudden chill in the air. The temperature had dropped noticeably, even though the heater was running. I stood up to adjust the thermostat, but when I turned around, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. There, in the far corner of the room, was a shadow. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I blinked, it seemed to grow larger. It wasn't cast by anything in the room. It was its own entity, a dark, shifting mass that seemed to move in unnatural ways. My heart raced as I stared at it, unable to move, paralyzed by fear. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the shadow faded, leaving the room in its normal state. I turned on all the lights, checking every corner of the apartment. Nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the days passed, the incidents became more frequent. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible voices coming from the direction of the kitchen. I'd go into the kitchen, only to find it empty. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, movement where there should be none. I would rush over to check, but again, there was nothing there. One evening, I was sitting in the living room trying to relax with a book when I felt it, a presence behind me. It was as if someone were standing right there, breathing down my neck. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned around, expecting to see someone there. But the room was empty. The silence was deafening. I had had enough. I called my friend, Mia, and asked her to come over. I needed someone to talk to, someone to help me make sense of it all. She agreed to come over, and we sat in the living room, chatting about life and catching up. But then, as we were talking, the lights flickered. The sound of something scraping across the floor echoed through the room. Mia looked at me, her face pale. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I nodded, feeling my stomach churn with dread. The noises had been happening more often recently, but hearing them with someone else in the room made it all the more real. Then we heard the door. The knock. The same soft, hesitant tap I had heard on my first night. But this time, Mia heard it too. We both turned to look at the door. It was as if the air had thickened, the atmosphere heavy with tension. I stood up slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened it, there was no one there. But just as I was about to close it, I saw something on the floor. It was a small handwritten note. The paper was old, yellowed, and frayed at the edges. I picked it up with shaking hands and read the words, "Leave while you can. It's watching you." I dropped the note as if it had burned me. Mia gasped beside me, her face pale and wide-eyed. We both stood there in stunned silence, the weight of what we had just read sinking in. I quickly slammed the door shut, locking it, my heart racing. That night, I didn't sleep. The sound of the whispers had returned, louder this time, as if the voices were directly in my ear. I could hear them clearly now, murmuring just out of reach, like someone was standing right next to me but was too far to see. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming, suffocating. The next day, I decided to do some research on the building. I went to the library and started going through old records, hoping to find something that would explain the strange occurrences. It wasn't long before I came across an article about the building. It was dated back to the early 1900s and was written about a fire that had occurred in the building's second floor. The fire had claimed the lives of several people, and many of the survivors reported hearing strange noises in the building after the incident. Some even claimed to have seen shadows moving in the halls. The article mentioned that the building had been abandoned for years before it was renovated and turned into apartments. The final line of the article sent a chill down my spine. Several tenants have reported feeling a presence, and some have disappeared without a trace. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Was I living in the same place where people had died in a fire? The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. No wonder the place felt so off. I wasn't just experiencing strange phenomena, I was living in a place that seemed to be cursed. I left the library that day feeling more unsettled than ever. But things only got worse when I returned to the apartment. That night, I heard something new, a loud bang, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was walking around in the apartment above me, but when I went upstairs to knock on the door, there was no answer. The footsteps continued, as if someone was pacing the floor above. I knocked again, louder this time, but still no answer. I was terrified. It felt as if the building itself was alive, breathing, watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that apartment wanted me gone, and it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. I packed my bags that night, not bothering to take anything but the essentials. I couldn't stay there another minute. As I walked out the door, I heard it once more, the soft knock. I turned around, but this time I didn't go back inside. I couldn't. I moved to a new place, far away from that apartment. It's been years now, but every time I close my eyes, I can still hear those whispers, feel the cold breath on my neck. I don't know what was in that building or what it wanted, but I'm certain I never want to find out. Story the end.